Thank you, Speaker. I rise to address today's matter of public importance, which, of course, on the Wednesday of the sitting week before the budget, you would expect as an opposition-led MPI, is on the state of Victoria's economy. And, Speaker, sadly, I don't have good news. Victorians are paying more and we're getting less. We're paying more and we're getting less. Victorian families, Victorians right around this state are being ripped off by this Andrews Labor government every day of the week. And it's because the Andrews Labor government is mired in debt, they're addicted to taxes, and they've let fly a culture of waste which is being driven by their dependence on the union movement, and it's in their DNA. Waste is in their DNA, Speaker. They've created a financial emergency which every Victorian is now paying for. We are the highest tax state in the nation, Speaker, the highest tax state in the nation with the highest amount of debt than any other state. Each and every day, the people of Victoria are paying $10 million each and every day just to service the debt. And on the government's own figures, Speaker, that is increasing to $20 million a day, each and every day, just to service the debt and the economic circumstance that those opposite have got us into. And why does that matter? Why does that matter? And why does that matter in your community? And why does that matter in my community? Because it means we've got less money, less opportunity to do the things that matter. I think, Speaker, of how $10 million could be transformational in my community of Sandringham. I think of how $10 million could be transformational in my colleagues' communities. In my own community, I know that $10 million would provide the needed infrastructure for 3 local primary schools. And that's just the interest repayment that we're paying today. What about tomorrow? At the end of the week, it's $70 million. And in just 2 short years' time, Speaker, on the government's own figures, it's increasing from $10 million a day to $20 million a day. And on the government's own projections in the pre-election budget update, it's only getting worse. Since this government was elected 9 years ago, Victoria's tax take is set to double, and over the next 3 years, Labor's tax take will continue to increase on their own figures by more than 14%. Next Tuesday's budget, Speaker, is set to inflict more pain on Victorians at a time when they can least afford it. Victorian families in need of everyday cost of living relief are instead likely to be hit with job losses, higher taxes and cuts to health, roads and community infrastructure. And just coming out of the federal budget, Speaker, just last week. Now, you know, Speaker, I would like to think that state Labor would look to federal Labor and think they had a friend. Now, Speaker, on the basis of the budget that the Albanese government delivered and the impact that that has on Victoria, it's clear that they have no friend, and from a Victorian Labor perspective, they have no impact with their Labor mates in the nation's capital. At a time when New South Wales and Queensland both receive in roads funding $10 billion, Victoria receives $5.8 billion. Now, some people in this chamber may have had the opportunity to drive on roads in New South Wales, to drive on roads in Queensland, and by comparison to the roads that we have here in Victoria, they're actually all right in New South Wales, they're actually all right in Queensland, but in Victoria, they are absolute death traps, and yes, that's in regional Victoria, and I'm grateful to a number of country members who are, and certainly National Party colleagues who are in the chamber today to hear this, and they will know that better than most people. So why, Speaker, does New South Wales and Queensland get $10 billion, and why do we in Victoria get $5.8 billion? If the Victorian Labor government in this state were looking to Canberra for a friend, well, perhaps they don't have a friend in me. Now, when it comes to health, an $810 million cut to hospitals in Victoria. The last time I checked, we were in the midst of a health crisis. You still need to wait 6 hours to be seen at the Box Hill Hospital Emergency Department just to be assessed. We still have ambulances ramping right around this state. We still have emergency situations, code reds, code oranges, most days of the week. And what does Canberra deliver for Victoria but an $810 million cut to our hospitals? And then you look further north again, Speaker, to Queensland, where the Olympics will be hosted in about 8 years' time. By one measure, sometime in the never-never. But in the next 4 years, the Commonwealth Games will be hosted here in Victoria. Now, the federal government's contribution to Queensland for the Olympics in 8 years' time was around $3.5 billion in this federal budget. And what do we get in Victoria for the Commonwealth Games? Donuts. Thank you, the member for Narrowcan. Absolute and utter donuts. Now, we know the Premier likes donuts, but in this case, donuts means pain for Victorians. Not since, Speaker, the Kane-Kerner governments of the late 1980s and the early 1990s have we seen such financial delinquency in this state. Because of Labor's financial incompetence, Victorians are now paying $10 million a day in interest alone on our soaring debt. Major projects, as I've said before and many have said before, have blown out by more than $30 billion. And we are facing future delays to Melbourne Airport Rail Link, Geelong Fast Rail. Waste and delays are part of this government's DNA. Victorians are paying the highest taxes of any state in the nation. Speaker, $5,638 per person, thanks to 44 new or increased taxes introduced by this Labor government in the last 9 years. They make mistakes and every Victorian pays the price of their mistakes. If you, Speaker, if you are a parent wanting to send your child to a state school, you pay, over the course of sending your child to that state school from foundation right through to year 12, $102,807 to educate your child. The highest education expense in a public school system in the nation. You compare that to the outcomes that students in Victoria are sadly receiving compared to other states, and it does not equate. Victorians are paying for a health system that spends less per person, Speaker, on public hospitals than any other state or territory except South Australia. Victorians, time and time again, whether it be car rego with bad roads, whether it be health and hospitals with bad outcomes, whether it be more for education with worse results, are paying more and they're getting less every day of the week because of the way that this government has managed the Victorian economy. And while the Premier, Speaker, blames the federal government, the pandemic, the Reserve Bank, he blames everybody except the person who is actually responsible for the circumstance that they have got us into, and that is, frankly, himself. And no wonder his colleagues, like the minister at the table, are canvassing support as speculation ramps up about when the Premier might leave, because you can't be the problem and also the solution. This is a tired government mired in debt, that have run out of ideas, that have run out of a legislative program in this place, addicted to taxes, and which has no plans to get us out of the mess that it has created itself. So, Speaker, what should the Andrews government do? Well, for this budget to be credible and to actually help Victorians that need help at this point in time, they must create jobs, not cut them. It must not raise taxes or introduce new ones. It must provide stamp duty relief for first home buyers and provide funding to tackle our dangerous roads. It must rein in debt and cost blowouts on major projects. It must commit, Speaker, to building the Melbourne Airport Rail Link and the Geelong Fast Rail, particularly when the federal government funding is there for both of those projects. Victorians have waited long enough, so what is the Andrews government waiting for? It must deliver the operating surplus that it promised in last year's budget, of $0.9 billion, promised in 25-26, and it must secure and upgrade the state's credit rating and put Victoria on a sustainable financial footing. I'm sorry to say that in our view, there is little cause for optimism. There's little cause for optimism because the Premier has spoken about very difficult decisions ahead because of the government's, in his words, not mine, extraordinary debt levels, and refused to rule out new taxes or tax increases. And then there's the issue of last year's state budget. It condemned Victoria to a 43% rise in debt over the next 3 years. It nearly doubled the state's annual interest repayments to $7.4 billion. That's $7.4 billion that could be used, if it wasn't being used to pay off our debt, on the things that matter to the lives of everyday Victorians. Teachers in schools, nurses in hospitals, police on the beat, keeping our communities safe. But we can't do that, Speaker. We can't do that because of the economic circumstance that this government has got us in. When a household or a business has too much debt, it's often the family members, owners and shareholders who might bear the brunt of those decisions that were made. It might not always seem fair, but that is often the case. But when this government, Speaker, goes on a debt-fuelled spending spree, it's the 6.8 million Victorians who pay for the decisions that they have made. Some Victorians will now pay the price of the Andrews government's debt-fuelled spending through job cuts, reduction to services and cancellation and delays in vital infrastructure projects. The Premier himself told Victorians before the state election last November they could have it all, when he knew they simply couldn't. Not only did he promise something he couldn't deliver, but he's now about to punish the people for his own and his government's incompetence. Speaker, they deserve better. Now, in the time that I have remaining, I want to debunk just a couple of myths ahead of next Tuesday's state budget. I am sure that over the next few weeks we will hear those opposites say that we are in this financial circumstance because of COVID. Well, let me tell you why this is not true. Speaker, in the projected 2022-2023 debt from 2019-20 figures, stick with me here, Speaker, it was $54.9 billion. The projected net debt was $54.9 billion. Now, let's be generous. And by the government's own figures, their total COVID spend was $35.8 billion. Well, that still doesn't add up, Speaker, because our current net debt position is $116 billion. And before anyone pulls out the calculator, and I know the member for Frankston's very keen to do so, the difference between what was projected, and let's be very generous and say that all of the COVID spending is considered against your net debt position, there's still a difference of $25.3 billion. So to say that we're in the financial circumstance that we're currently in because of COVID is absolute bollocks. It's absolute rubbish. No one should buy that lie. And I think very highly of Victorians, Speaker. I think very, very highly of them. And I am sure that they will not buy that lie.
Member for Sandringham. That word is unparliamentary.
Thank you, Speaker. I seek to make that table available to the House. Now, within that COVID spending of $35.8 billion, there are certain things within that spending which is questionable. It's questionable whether they are in fact COVID-related or related to items of normal government spending. Included in that, by the government's own figures from the Department of Treasury and Finance's own website, it includes $110 million for the government's power-saving bonus, $94 million spent on community sport, $67 million spent on solar homes, $38 million spent on clean energy. It's questionable, Speaker, that when the government says that their debt has been exacerbated by the COVID circumstance and that they consider all of this as part of their COVID spending, that it has in fact been COVID spending at all. And before we hear in rebuttal from members of the government that they have doubled Victoria's public service and therefore Victoria's public sector wage bill, let me just draw the House's attention to something that I found particularly staggering. 142% increase in public servants earning around $350,000 since 2019, and a tripling in bureaucrats earning more than $500,000 since 2019. This is not the reality of Victorians. This is not the reality of Victorian families. We're paying more, we're getting less.
Members' time has expired.